Hello, I'm Bruce Lorincz, and this show is entitled Bruce on the Loose. We're going to change up a little bit with the virus throughout the Ohio and national and international scene. And we're going to go ahead, I do some tutoring at Isham and read books at Valley View and also Overlook. So we're going to go ahead and read some books to some of our younger students, and hopefully their parents can also glean some information from the stories that we're going to go ahead and focus on. The first book that I'm going to feature is called Granite, and the author is Susan Butcher, and David Monson helped her, and the illustrator is Sarah Douglas. The initial page, I got this idea. We went on a cruise, my wife and I, last summer, and we visited several musher areas that had trained dogs to be in the Iditarod and other races. And Susan Butcher won, believe it or not, 4 Iditarod races. She passed away, unfortunately, with leukemia, but her daughter signed a copy of her book for us, and that was the title page, and we're surely glad that she was able to carry on, and she is a trainer of dogs as well. So I'm going to take my glasses off for a minute to go ahead and begin with the page, and it is certainly a very interesting story. You will certainly find out. To all the dogs who preceded Granite, to his teammates, to who his victories possible, to all who follow in his paw prints. That was the initial, what Granite, the dog, said to some of the other dogs that he ran into. Moving on, each year a sled dog race crosses the frozen wilderness of Alaska. It is called the Iditarod. Starting in Anchorage, it crosses 3 mountain ranges, 2 river valleys, and a frozen Bering Sea, ending over 1,000 miles later in Nome. The race honors dogs and mushers who hauled mail, supplies, and life-saving medicine through the Alaska wilderness over 100 years ago. The dog in the Iditarod race came to epitomize the strength, courage, and intelligence of those dogs long ago. And Granite is the feature of this particular book, and we see in the picture how far Anchorage is way down on the right-hand side, and it goes ahead and believe it or not is 1,152 miles exactly to the finish in Nome, Alaska. All right, Susan Butcher lived alone in the Alaska wilderness with her sled dogs. Her home was a little log cabin. Susan was a musher. So in the winter, she traveled across the snow-covered trails on a dog sled. The dogs loved pulling her sled, and she loved them in return. So she started with only 2 dogs, and as years went on, she added. She was, again, originally from Massachusetts and moved to the Alaska state to go ahead, and she loved animals and the environment. One spring day, while Susan was feeding her dogs, she heard a familiar sound. Puppies were being born. Quietly, she walked over to the barn. Listening at the door, she heard cooing. Slowly, she looked inside, and there on a cozy bed of straw were 5 newborn pups. Their mother gently nuzzled them and cleaned each one with her tongue as they lay curled up next to her. All the pups were shiny, fat, and healthy, except for one. His fur was dull, he had knock knees, and he let the others push him away from their mother. Susan loved the puppies and was proud of each one. She was always showing them to other mushers who visited. Again and again, the visitors would say they looked great, except for the thin and the timid one. They said he would never become a real sled dog, and she should give him away to someone as a pet. But Susan believed in him, so she gave him a strong name, Granite. When the pups were old enough, she started taking them on daily walks in the woods. Susan and the puppies developed a close bond. Susan watched Granite and was impressed by his intelligence. He always knew where he was because he remembered the trails they had taken before. Even when they went somewhere new, he could find his way home alone while his brothers and sisters closely followed Susan so they would not get lost. Every evening they ran together to develop his strength. She was sure that someday he would race on her team. Granite grew to be 58-pound, deep-chested, fast dog. He overcame his knock knees with powerful stride. He pulled the sled better than the other dogs, and his confidence grew. He learned to lead the team. Leaders need to be able to guide the team over rough trails, find the way they were so they are not lost, and run fast. Granite did all three. After years of work, Granite became the main lead dog of Susan's racing team. At the start of his first Iditarod, Granite seemed to sense it was a race. He stood in front of the team with his head held high, waiting for the command to go. Finally, the race started, and Granite charged down the trail. Susan was amazed by him. They stopped often to eat and rest. When it was time to go again, Granite would be the first to jump to his feet, barking and prancing, anxious to head down the trail. Soon they were leading the race. One night, when they crossed a small hill, there in the trail ahead of them stood an angry moose. Susan stopped the team to let the moose get away, but it didn't run. Instead, it charged into the team, kicking and stomping. Granite lunged at the moose, trying to protect his teammates, but the moose kicked him and he flew against a tree. When the attack was over, Susan saw the damage the moose had done. She gently cared for her injured teammates before deciding that for the good of the beloved dogs, they should leave their dream of winning behind. They withdrew from the race. She took her bruised and battered team home, but promised the dogs that next year they would win. People doubted Susan and Granite. They often said, Susan will never win the Iditarod because she babies her dogs. Susan didn't listen to them and continued to care for her dogs as she always had. It was a long, hard year. Susan and the dogs worked tirelessly to recover. In the fall, Susan and her dogs started running every day, training for the race. One day, on a short run, Susan saw Granite falter. She stopped the team and rushed to him. It was quickly clear to her something was wrong. Granite tried, but he could not get to his feet. Granite's temperature was soaring. His heart was racing, and he was fading fast. Granite needed help, but help was far away. Susan bundled him up, and they flew to a veterinary hospital. The doctor held little hope for his recovery. Susan sat on a cot to see Granite and stayed with him day and night, petting him and willing him to live. Granite lived, but the veterinarian gently told Susan he would never race again. The illness had damaged his heart. When Granite was able, they flew back home. Susan and the dogs continued to train while Granite rested in the cabin, watching the leaves turn colors and slowly fall. Before the snow came, the dogs pulled Susan on a four-wheeled cart to get stronger. Granite cried and howled every time the team left him behind. He was determined to get better. Susan, slowly but surely, Granite showed improvement. The veterinarian told Susan Granite could start running loose with the puppies. As winter came, Granite was back in the team, but only training with young dogs on shorter runs. Meanwhile, the main racing team was running many long miles under the northern lights. Still, every night after Susan returned, Granite would sleep on her bed. Gradually, his strength returned. The doctor was amazed at his progress. As a test of his recovery, Susan let him run a short race with the young dogs. Granite proved he was healthy by leading the team to victory. His determination, drive, and strength convinced Susan he could race the Iditarod again. But had his endurance come back, could he finish the 1,000-mile race? The Iditarod started in early March. Granite was at the starting line, leading her team again. To win, they had to beat last year's champion. Day after day, the two teams raced, always close to each other. The trail turned out to be tough for Susan and her team. The sled broke, and many times they were lost, but Granite never faltered. Near the end of the race, the two teams were only 17 seconds apart. Susan and Granite were ahead, but suddenly the other team passed them and pulled away. Susan thought, well, I guess second place is okay. Then she looked at the dogs working so hard and remembered her promise to them. This is our year to win. She called out to Granite, and he responded. They charged by the other team. Again, they had a small lead in the race. As they left an Eskimo village 100 miles from the finish line in Nome, a furious storm hit. Susan often could not see the trail, but Granite kept on going. Finally, the snow was blowing across the ground so thick Susan couldn't even see Granite at the front of the team. Granite had to find the trail on his own. From time to time, he would get lost, so Susan would lean into the wind and walk up to the front of the team to help him regain the trail. Together, they went on. As the storm raged, Susan's arms were becoming frozen. She could barely hang on to the sled. They had to get shelter soon. Granite saw that Susan needed his help. Finally, Susan couldn't move at all. Her arms were hurting so badly that she was beginning to lose hope. But Granite kept forging ahead. He knew Susan was in trouble, and it was up to him to get them through. The other dogs were following his lead. If he quit, they would too, and all would be lost. He kept going step after step on through the blizzard. Susan was quiet and hunched over the sled. This was it. Suddenly, they saw dim lights from the next checkpoint. They had made it through the blizzard. Susan and team rested there, eating hot meals throughout the stormy night. In the morning, they ran the last 76 miles to Nome and won the Iditarod. All of the other teams in the race had been turned back by the storm and did not finish until 18 hours later. Susan and Granite had done it. They had won the Iditarod and set a new record time. The next 2 years they won again, with Granite proudly leading the team. With Susan's love and Granite's strength, they had become unstoppable. Now those same people who had not believed in them said, "It's no wonder they won the race, because she takes the best care of her dogs, and they take care of her." Well, I hope you enjoyed that story of the race, the Iditarod and Granite. This is the final page, and I think John may have that as well. And it does show some of the places where the dogs are staying during the summer, especially. There is their training. And on my cruise to Alaska, I also have a kind of a more detailed picture of that with the houses the dogs are, and sometimes the dogs like to get on the roof of the houses and go ahead and bark at each other and trying to get attention and getting ready to get something to eat. So it's a real interesting, and you can see the mountain behind. This was just outside of Nome, Alaska, which is the capital, and it is really an interesting place to go and visit. And on the other page, that also shows on this page right here, it even shows a little sprinkle of a glacier that a lot of it, of course, had melted, but there's a little picture of a glacier, again, outside of Juneau. And on this picture, we can see, the places where the dogs stay, the staging area with the roof over it where they hook the dogs up, and they get so excited. It's so difficult to get the dogs hooked up because they want to please their masters so much and their trainers. They just jump up and down, and it's not easy to get the dogs hooked up. And then at the top there are two pictures of my wife, Debbie, and I with two puppies. They were being raised there, and they, again, get them out running as early as they can so that they learn the ways of a musher, and it's very, very interesting. Once the cold weather comes in mid-September, then they go ahead and, because it gets so cold and so snowy there, they move into the continental United States. I think this group that we saw was going to Colorado, so that was the situation there. One other thing I'd like to mention on regards to the distance, if we're talking about Wadsworth, Ohio, the 1,152 official miles of the Iditarod goes from Wadsworth, and it would end at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It would be, again, by car, that is probably about a 19-hour, or depending on stops, 20-hour trip by car, and it does take considerable number of days to finish the Iditarod race. In fact, it goes ahead and takes usually more than 2 weeks. Susan, when she set that record, was 15 days and some 7 hours. So you can see it's a long trip, again, over mountains. And each year they change the course, and they have checkpoints and a lot of rules with the Iditarod, which I didn't really know until I went on the cruise and did some further reading. So really it's a very interesting situation. A colleague of Susan Butcher's, Libby Riddles, was the first woman to win the Iditarod in 1985, then started Susan with her 3 consecutive championships in 1986, 1987, 1988. She finished second in 1989 and won again in 1990. And Granite was the lead dog in all those victories that Susan Butcher had. So he's quite a dog, and certainly he lived to age 17, and she really enjoyed working with him. And I think, boys and girls and moms and dads, I think it goes to show that if you have a commitment and you go ahead and want to go ahead and set a goal for yourself. Susan Butcher was in 17 Iditarod races. She was in 8 races before she ever won for the first time. So that lets us know that if you have consistency and you believe in yourself, and in this case she believed in her dogs and she trained them and talked to them, and maybe in the end the kindness that she showed the dogs really proved to be what was the difference in that race. To think that there are, by the way, you can have up to 14 dogs on the Iditarod race, but you must finish with at least 5 dogs. Sometimes, of course, dogs get sick. They don't perform very well. They have various problems, especially with their paws. The one book I read talked about the constant changing of the footwear of dogs so they wouldn't get ice in their pads and they wouldn't get sore paws, because it's so significant for them to go ahead and pull the sled. Many times up the hills, the mushers don't stay on the sled. They run along and try to help the dogs because they know it's very has a lot of weight to it, because they have all their equipment, their flashlights, and some mushers do run at night, and it's very, very difficult to stay on the path. So they have flashlights and hatchets and all sorts of things to go ahead and get things accomplished. I would comment for a second about the picture about the moose. That moose, we didn't make that story up, but moose are very stubborn. They sometimes, even when we were on a bus tour, the tour guide said that moose sometimes get in the way, and they can, because they weigh over 1,500 pounds, they can do damage if a car would happen to hit into a moose. And they're very stubborn. They go at their own pace, and if they don't want to leave a certain area, they won't. And in fact, in that problem, 2 of Susan Butcher's dogs passed away, and several others were injured, and it took them quite a while to recover. So she withdrew from that race. That was one of her 17 that she was involved in. Susan Butcher also certainly set a standard for other mushers. She was very consistent, the first person ever to win 3 consecutive Iditarod races, and certainly women became more prevalent in that sport with her being in leadership position. In the first week, the first Saturday of March begins the Iditarod in Anchorage, and 65 people last year began to have different, and they go at different times to start on the 1,152-mile race to Nome, Alaska. Also, another story I picked up when I was on my cruise, that one year they had a race. A plane would go from Anchorage to Nome with supplies, and a dog sled would go. Well, believe it or not, you would think the plane would win, but because of such very difficult conditions in the winter, the dog sled ended up beating the plane and getting to Nome ahead of the airplane. So that was quite a story, and I couldn't believe it. And I certainly know how difficult it is, the terrain in Alaska is. So this has been our first, and we hope, a series of books that we can read to our students and parents and other interested parties in Wadsworth and beyond. And this is Bruce on the Loose, and I thank you very much for viewing.